Welcome everyone to the Sanford Institute of Philanthropy Welcoming Objections webinar. We're so delighted to have you all join us today. My name is Emmanuel Takahashi and I'm the Program Director here at the Sanford Institute of Philanthropy, and I will also be your host. So let's see if everything is working fine. Just a couple notes on what we do here at the Sanford Institute of Philanthropy. Really, our mission is to educate nonprofit leaders and development officers to develop their fundraising capabilities and obviously increase their impact. The Sanford Institute of Philanthropy was started in 2014 at National University in Southern California, and since then, we have grown to a network of 11 sites across the nation, and we are very delighted to have customers, participants, joining us from all different types of states, from Florida, where we have National Leadership Institute, from the Northeast with Long Island University, to being in Northern California with John F. Kennedy University. We also have a partner in Seattle, CDU of Seattle, and also in Arizona with Maricopa Community Colleges. And I hope I didn't forget anybody, Augustana in South Dakota and Bellevue University in Nebraska. So really, it's great to have you all here from all those different places in the nation. So to date, I'm going to go back. We have educated about 15,000 nonprofit leaders, and we're really glad, that the one thing that our students report to us is that they really feel engaged with the content, and that also, everything we teach is applicable. So we hope that today, you're going to be able to get some very practical tips on how to work with your donors when they object. And now that you're joining our network, we hope that we can continue the discussion online. And if you are tweeting or posting on Facebook, please use the hashtag SIPwebinar. We also like to make our webinars interactive. So at any time, feel free to use the Q&A section or box to ask a question, or also you can use the chat. So I'd like to start by introducing our speakers for today. We have first Dr. Lena Rodriguez, who's the endowed director of the Sanford Institute of Philanthropy and has a proven track record of advancing organizations and causes, having served, for example, as the Chief Marketing and Development Officer at the Kauffman Foundation. There, she was able to secure $14.5 million in less than 14 months. She also earned her PhD in business from the University of Nebraska, an MPA, and as well as an MPA and a bachelor's degree from Arizona State University. Dr. Rodriguez is joined today by Hope Carlson, who is the Chief Development Officer at the San Diego Museum of Man. There, Hope leads a team of fundraising professionals and is part of the executive management team, as well as overseeing the marketing department. Prior to being at the Museum of Man, Hope was the interim executive director of the San Diego Civic Youth Ballet and spent 4 years as a strategy consultant for the Boston Consulting Group. She holds an MBA from Harvard Business School, an MM in Vocal Performance and Literature, as well as a BA from the University of Virginia. So we have great speakers, presenting to us today. And so I'm going to stop talking now and pass it on to Lena and Hope.
Thank you, Emmanuel, and welcome, Hope, and welcome everyone out there in our webinar land. I'd like to start today by reviewing the cause-selling cycle. And I always like to start here because this is a model or a diagram that really represents the steps that we take as fundraisers or development officers when we're prospecting, soliciting, or cultivating. And if you look at the actual chart here, the cycle, you'll see all of those phases are displayed here on the chart. What we're going to be focusing on today is number 6, which is welcoming objections. And I like to say, instead of welcoming objections, I like to say we embrace objections as fundraisers and development officers. The other thing that I'd like to point out here in this chart, and I'm sure all of you know this and embrace this as well, is that the cultivation piece occurs in all of these phases, from step 1 through step 8, and it's a continuous process, and that's not represented here, but we all know that cultivation is very, very critical. So again, let's move on to embracing objections and start talking about how we embrace these objections that oftentimes happen with our donors. So on the next slide, what we're going to talk about is the traditional model versus the relationship model of cause selling. And most of us know that in the traditional model of cause selling, a lot of time you can see was spent on us doing the talking. So telling, qualifying, presenting, closing, and you can see on that chart on the left-hand side that it's really all about talking at the donor. But when we look at the second model, the one on the right, we see that most of us use this type of model today. And this one is really the one that we embrace when we talk about cause selling, because cause selling is really all about the relationship. And so here, we're focusing a lot on building the trust, probing for questions, selling the benefits. And if you look at the bottom, when we look at this particular model, a majority of our time is focusing on the listening, and we're building trust with our donor. So bottom line here, if we look at this, we want to use the pyramid method, the one on the right, where we're doing a lot of listening and getting to know our donors. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Hope, and have her talk a little bit about how we handle these objections that we get.
Thank you, Lena. Hello, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be with you here today. As we dive more specifically into handling objections, I'd like to hear from all of you what you're hoping to get out of today's webinar. If you can type a few words into your message box and let us know, that would be terrific. I'll give you a moment to respond.
I hope everybody can see the chat box. That's really where we would like to hear from you about what you want to learn today. Somebody said overcoming objections, of course.
We'll work on that.
Yes.
Useful conversational tips and advice, that's great. An experience of listening and learning, experiences with donors, key phrases.
Oh, this is wonderful. Great feedback.
New ideas, building trust, finding potential donors, so many great ideas. Board participation, anticipating objections. That's fantastic. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And what happens when the prospect knows the ask is coming but goes blank or does not respond and changes the subject? Oh, that's a really good one too. Welcoming objections, wonderful. That's a key theme for us too. Well, we will try to get to as many of these ideas as we possibly can in this webinar, but certainly there will be time for Q&A as well. And so if there are other things that come to mind for you, I hope you'll share them with us and ask us as we go and at the end as well. Fantastic. Thank you so much for weighing in. Well, handling objections. As you all know, as we work with donors and philanthropy, it's all about people. And people have different passions and ideas, and that means that resistance happens. So one of the keys is to know what the real objection is. Sometimes people will say, I'm too busy to meet right now. And does that really mean that they're too busy, or does it mean that they just don't want to be asked right then, or they're not fond of this particular project, or is it that they really are too busy? What is the real objection underneath it? Someone had said in the question box, what happens when the prospect knows the ask is coming but doesn't respond and changes the subject? You know, is that an objection that really is hiding something else underneath it as well? Another key is to know how to address the objection in favor of the donor. Big theme in our world these days is always being donor-centric. So how do you put yourself in their shoes and really think about it in a way that helps them find what they're most interested and passionate about? But also you need to know if there are situations beyond your control. At the museum where I work, we have an ask to a donor currently for about $25,000 for a bench in our tower that is reopened to the public for the first time in 80 years. And we've been in dialogue with this particular donor, and midway through, his wife had some significant health issues that cropped up and landed her in the hospital. And so that's a situation beyond all of our control. And so, of course, we're pausing the conversation and not pursuing that ask right now. We're just letting them know that we're there for them and, you know, ready to reopen the conversation whenever it's good for them, but also wanting to make sure that they're okay. And so when you make an ask, it should be a natural progression. That's true in terms of the timing of an ask conversation in the situation with the donor I just described. It's equally true in the conversation itself. That's an ask conversation. You don't ever want an ask to be a surprise or come out of the blue. You also want it to flow naturally from everything you've been talking about beforehand in that pyramid model that Lena outlined in terms of cause selling as well. So let's dive in a little more specifically and start by redefining what objections actually are. Sometimes I think the word can feel like a giant wall in front of us that feels like a hot stove where we sort of jump back. But that's not actually what it needs to be. We can actually welcome objections as part and parcel of the normal course of conversation. And to do so, relationships matter. If you have close relationships with your donors, if you've built that trust and rapport, they will tell you what's on their minds. As you talk with them about your programs and what's happening here and what's going on in their lives and what they're passionate about, you will find that concerns and questions they have come up in the normal course of conversation and relationship building. And that really is a series of things that you could consider objections, but actually are really part of just normal dialogue and getting to know each other. To do that well, you have to listen really deeply, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. You also have the opportunity to turn objections into pivot moments, a concept that we'll also talk about later in the presentation. And it's important to know that not every objection needs to be addressed. Sometimes your donor just wants to be heard, to express concerns, but they're not things that are deal breakers for that donor in terms of contributing to the project or your organization. And they just want to know that you've listened and you're taking it into consideration as you move forward with your work.
Well, we all have had one or all of these types of individuals that demonstrated these types of objections. I'm sure many of you have encountered a donor who was what we call the stall or demonstrated the stall. And this is a person, as you can imagine, who puts you off. So that person who says, you know, I'm going to have to leave in 20 minutes. Or I have a really important meeting, so I just can't make the decision right now. That's not a bad thing. That's somebody who, when we examine this more deeply, as Hope had talked about, really trying to understand what is the stall all about. So again, really trying to get a better understanding as to what information they're requiring so they can make a more informed decision. The searcher is that donor who is actually looking for more information or for more data. And they'll probably just come out and ask you that. And we have all had those types of individuals that say, you know, can I see your 990s? Can I have a copy of your strategic plan? So this is not uncommon. And again, this is a person who is still interested. They're demonstrating that they're still interested, but they're just looking for some more data. And, you know, you can easily provide them with that. The hidden objection, that one's a little harder because it's endemic in the title, right? It's hidden. So oftentimes we don't necessarily know why the donor is saying they're just not ready to move forward with a gift, or they're not really ready to fully commit. And this is something that's, again, it's more difficult to overcome, but it's not insurmountable. So Hope was talking about a potential donor that she had, and that could have easily been an example of a hidden objection the individual that had a spouse that was ill. Had they not come forward with that, then that would have been probably more or less a hidden objection. But it obviously is not a definite no. So talking about the definite no, that would be the stopper. And that's the person who is just definitely not interested, period. And this is one objection that you really can't overcome. And in some instances, I wouldn't see this as negative, because I think what this is really demonstrating is that your donor is not in sync or is not in synergy with your mission and vision of your institution. So if you have a stopper and they're just not amenable to moving forward, that's okay, because there's just not a good match. So Hope, can you tell us a little bit about those times that would be logical times for responding?
Absolutely. So when you do get these objections, when do you actually answer them? How do you know when to answer them? Well, there are 4 different ways and times to answer them. One is before they even come up. You can anticipate and forestall the objections, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. You can postpone the answer and say, let me look into that and get back to you. You can answer immediately, or you can choose not to answer at all. And this is a technique that you use when an excuse comes up. So anticipating and forestalling an objection. As I started to mention a little bit earlier, if you build relationships really deeply with your donors, you can avoid objections before they arise, because they will express their concerns to you in the course of conversation, and you'll have a chance to answer them more organically. But if you are asking for a particular project and you know your donor really well and you are pretty sure that an objection is going to come up specifically, you can answer it in advance with your presentation, but you need to evaluate the objection first in 2 ways. So number 1, will the objection mean this program is not a good fit for this donor? If I have a donor who is passionate about education but has said to me before, the collections you have at the museum, they're fine, but they're really not my cup of tea, I'm not going to ask that donor for a collections gift, even if I have this massive campaign that means that I should be asking everybody I can think of for it. Instead, I'm going to go to them for education and find another avenue. So ask them for something else if you think that objection is really going to be an issue of fit. But second, how likely is that objection to arise? If you've assessed it and you say, I don't think it's really about fit, I think that this is just something that we can work through, then think about whether it will really come up in the conversation before you decide to address it in advance, because you don't want to borrow trouble. So don't feel pressured to answer absolutely every possible twist and turn in the road. However, in certain instances where you know the donor well, you have the concerns top of mind, build it into your presentation in a way that helps them feel comfortable with what you're bringing up in terms of the project and the ask. The second time to answer is when you are in need of more information, so you can postpone the answer. To do this, you want to really listen deeply so that you understand the objection fully. What are they asking? Why are they asking it? What are the different nuances of information that they might be thinking about now and that they would think about in a second and third order question when you bring that information back? Ask for time to investigate an answer. That's a great question. I so appreciate your bringing that up. Let me talk to our team and get back to you. And then be thoughtful in your response. You want to be thoughtful in 2 ways. Number 1, you want to identify the time when you're going to get back to them. I'll get back to you next week, and then follow through with that. So being thoughtful in your commitment to them. And then second, you want to be thoughtful in terms of the depth of the answer you give to them. If you're taking more time to go investigate something, be sure you get that comprehensive answer and be sure that you communicate not only the answer to that question, but the other nuances that you think they may be concerned about in addition. And make sure at the same time that you're finding the best match for you and the donor. That's what you always want to keep top of mind. You never want your donor to feel like you're trying to strong arm them into giving to a project. Instead, this really is a matchmaking process. And that's true for answering their objections too. You want to go back to them and say, I found out the answer to your question and, you're right, this really is a concern. I understand that, that might not be the best fit for you at this time. Let's talk about it a little more. Or, hey, I got the answer for your question and it turns out this is a great fit for you. Let's talk more. Third, you can answer the, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say I really, really liked your response to this, because I think a lot of times as fundraisers and development officers, we are nervous to postpone the answer. So I really appreciate that you outline the fact that this is an opportunity for us to really customize information for our donor.
Thank you, Lena. Answering your objection immediately is another way to go. So if you have done your preparation up front and you really come to the table with all the different facts and figures at your fingertips in a way that your donor can really get an answer right then and there, that's terrific. It's helpful when you are certain you really know what their objection is and when you have a strong response for them. And this allows the donor to focus on the rest of the story, so you can just get that objection out of the way right then and there. It also shows that you're sincere, that you really passionately care about the project and the donor, and you're able to respond in a way that's a fit for them.
I know
Finally,
that
Lena, I'll ask you to touch upon the
sure. I know you had
question.
Yeah, no worries. I know that you had touched upon this a little earlier, so I won't labor over this, but we had talked about earlier really to try to understand, try to untease whether it is an excuse that the donor is giving you or a true objection. And if it is an objection, we'll hear it again. So again, this is not a bad thing. If it's an excuse, we probably want to move on. But if it is a true objection, we'll hear it again and we'll need to address that. Great. I'm going to go to the next slide that talks about what do we do when a donor says no. And my favorite thing to do when a donor says no is to really keep in the back of my mind the acronym OBJECT. So let's kind of go through this quickly. With the O, we observe and hear the prospect. With the B, we acknowledge, we be sure that we understand it. J is we acknowledge it. E is we elect a technique to use, and this is my favorite, so we'll come back to this one and we'll talk about that. C is communicate an answer to the objection, and then T is try to secure the gift. So when I hear a donor say no, I keep this acronym in the back of my head, and I make sure that I go through this acronym to ensure that I have done these things, that I've observed, I understood, I acknowledge, I made sure to examine and elect a technique, and then I communicate the answer to the objection. So let's talk about the O in object. Very, very simple. It's observe and listen to the prospect. So here again, even though we're really excited about what we do, we're excited about what we offer, we're passionate about our organization, we really have to make sure that we're listening more than what we're talking. So we're going to, going back to that inverted triangle that I had talked about earlier, this is all about listening. So you really want to tell the donor what it is that you need them to know.
B is for be sure to understand it. And this touches upon what is the real objection, which we talked about a bit earlier. Also, is there an emotional component? What fears and concerns does the donor have? There's a wonderful book that I recommend to all of you called Difficult Conversations, How to Discuss What Matters Most. It is by Douglas Stone, Bruce Patton, and Sheila Heen, and it talks about how in every difficult conversation, really the conversation is happening at three levels. There are the facts, there's the emotion, and there's the identity. What does this say about who I am and who this other person is? And I think it's a really useful framework to think about objections in the course of a donor conversation as well, because sometimes a donor is bringing up a concern that is really more deeply rooted in something emotional with the fears, ideas, passions, concerns that they have. And if you can get to the root of that and have that dialogue, it will help you uncover what the real objection is. You also want to think about, why is the donor asking this particular question? And what does the donor most want? What would be a satisfactory answer? And what's going to be a deal breaker for that donor? One of the examples that we think about in my museum is a conversation that we had with a particular foundation funder a couple years ago. We had been doing evening programming called Tower After Hours, which was linked to a particular country and culture with food and drink and music and dancing. And this foundation, the Nissan Foundation, funded it very generously for years. But then we decided that our strategy needed to change a bit with our evening programming. And so we sat down with them to request funding for this new version of the programming that was no longer linked to the countries and cultures so specifically. And they were intrigued, but also said no and objected, so to speak, to that new direction in programming. Rather than walking away and saying, well, I guess they're no longer a foundation funder for us, we really strove to understand what was underneath that. Why were they thinking about the programming differently? What did they want out of it? And we realized that they're very passionately committed to diversity. So we also have an exhibit called Race, Are We So Different? And there are a whole slew of workshops related to that touch upon questions of diversity and race and racism. And they now fund those programs, something completely different. But because we took the time to figure out what a satisfactory answer would be for them and what was really underneath their concerns and questions, that allowed us to pivot into this particular place where they are still a funder.
Well, thank you for sharing all that, Hope. It was very fascinating. The next part of the acronym is the J in object. And that's making sure that you acknowledge the donor's objection. And again, here's where we want to practice and demonstrate empathy, because there is obviously a reason for their objection. So we want to acknowledge it. The next one is my favorite. It is the E in object. And that is electing a technique to use. And here's where we talk a lot about DISC. In terms of what is a particular donor's behavioral style. And here, I tell you all this is my favorite because, again, we need to understand what our particular behavioral style is and make sure that we pivot to the behavioral style of our donor. So let me give you an example. Let's say that you're a donor, you go to your donor's office and they have all kinds of reports and pamphlets and documents. Clearly that may be a person that really thrives on receiving a lot of information. And let's say that you yourself is, maybe you're more of an amiable and you're more of a steady person, that's really not your style. Well, you'll want to pivot because you know that what is important to your donor is the numbers and the analytical side. So we have a seminar that addresses what your behavioral style is and really walk through in that seminar how you can pivot and mirror the behavioral style of your donor so that you can communicate more effectively.
Great. The C is to communicate the answer to the objection. So, of course, you want to find a way to address what their concern is. The answer needs to satisfy the donor if you're going to get a gift, and it has to be complete. So make sure, as a corollary to this, that you're really understanding everything that they're concerned about up front so that your answer can be complete. Don't be afraid for it to be a dialogue too. So if you communicate an answer and they kind of look a little puzzled, you should ask, well, is there anything else that's concerning to you? Does that make sense? Have I answered according to what you were hoping or not? And if not, why not? Make sure that that two-way street is open. And then also get a commitment from them for the next steps. That's another version of the C on this. It's okay if you need to set a follow-up meeting. Just make sure that you find that date or a follow-up action. And that gets to trying to secure the gift, the T, the last part of the acronym. Listen to the donor for his or her timing. In the instance I spoke about before with the donor with his wife having some health issues, in that particular conversation, when he told me about that, that would not have been the time for me to try to secure the gift. And so you want to know what's going on in your donor's life and when the appropriate timing really is. You also want to answer the objections or identify when you'll have that answer for the donor, as we talked about, and clarify too, is this objection something that the donor needs to be answered before he or she will be comfortable making that gift? Or is this something that's more of a curiosity question or a concern that they just want to communicate and talk with you about later? Consider too whether you need to pivot your ask to more closely align with the donor's interests. In the example of the Nissan Foundation, that's one instance where we made that choice to find another project that fit them better. And then don't be afraid to ask for that follow-up meeting. If today is not the right day for the ask, or if you need to postpone an answer to an objection that they need an answer for in order to be comfortable, make sure that you say, would it be okay if I reach back out to you in a week? Or would a month be better? What's a good time for me to connect with you for us to finish talking about this? So then there are specific techniques for negotiating objections. I know some of you had mentioned in the Q&A box that you really would like to know how to address these more specifically, and that's the part of the conversation we'll get to now. Listen deeply and actively, the curiosity method, feel, felt, found, compensation or counterbalance method, reframing the objection as an opportunity, and the pivot method are all excellent techniques that work. The first one is probably my favorite because I think that listening deeply and actively is something that always works and is always important in philanthropy. One key on this is to take the time. Don't rush ahead. If you only have an hour meeting, but your donor has an objection that he or she needs to talk about with you, it's okay to talk about that objection and to take the time. You don't need to be on your timing. You want to be on your donor's timing, and then ask for that follow-up meeting if you need it. Make sure that they feel heard and understood, and ask those open-ended questions. Why? How? Could you help me understand why you're thinking about it this way, or what you mean by this, or what you're concerned about? Then paraphrase. Make sure your donor really does feel completely understood. Curiosity is a related method. So this is a chance for you to stay in that open space with open energy and not get defensive in some way. Sometimes I know it's tempting for us when we're so passionate about a project to feel personally concerned when a donor says, well, I don't know about that. I don't really like the programming you're doing. It's too controversial. And you say, oh, really? Well, I was wondering why that is. What makes you say that? Tell me more. Stay in the curious space and listen from a journalist's investigative mind perspective. Be curious, because that will also help your donor feel understood, and it will uncover places where you can connect to really reshape the conversation and help your donor feel comfortable and find something that he or she is passionate about, whether it's part of this particular project or another.
Well, the next technique that I think is very helpful when you're negotiating objections is the feel, felt, and found. And the statement that I like to use with this particular technique is to state that you're showing empathy, and you're stating, I can understand how you feel. So again, you're acknowledging the donor's feelings, you're showing empathy, and then you say, I've had other donors who have felt the same way. That is a great place for them, because you're allowing them to feel like they're not alone with their objection. But it also allows you then to bridge that by saying, until they found out that, and then it gives you the opportunity to continue the discussion. So again, you'll have to be really prepared for that last piece, because you're, again, in a sense, making a mini presentation. The other technique is the counterbalance method. And this one is when you really admit that your organization has a disadvantage. So for instance, let's say that some donor comes to you and says, I'm really just not sure about donating to your particular organization because it's just much too new. And a lot of us have heard these types of objections. And so with the counterbalance method, this is where you would state things like, you'd say, you acknowledge it, that yes, we are 2 years new, but it also means that we're flexible, we're dynamic, we're eager, and we're really looking at new ways of making an impact. So these are the types of responses that you can give when someone brings some sort of an objection that you can counterbalance.
Another technique is to reframe the objection as an opportunity. So this is where you get to say, that's a really good point. How would you suggest that we address that? One of our donors to a new exhibit we have coming is elderly, and the exhibit is for Post Secret. We're developing it in-house. If you're not familiar with Post Secret, you can go to postsecret.com and read all about it. It's really fascinating. But it appeals mostly to a college student millennial market right now. And our donor said, you know, I'm interested in funding your work, but I have to say, I don't really understand how this is going to appeal to people like me. And that's a golden opportunity for us because she's people like her. So I am so excited about that because I get to say to her, let's talk more about this exhibit and you tell me, how do you think it would appeal? What excites you about this? Where do you connect with this? Which is really valuable to us in a whole host of ways as we look to expand the demographics and the target audience for this. Similarly, you can say we could really use someone with your expertise on our committee to help us think through these kinds of issues. Join us. And that's taking someone and really pulling them in to be an advocate and an ally. And, you know, all of our donors are very talented people with an array of expertise, and getting them to be able to share that expertise with you is also a wonderful way to not only build the relationship more deeply, but to tap into other resources beyond the treasure side of the equation when you're looking at time, talent, and treasure. Finally, there's the pivot method. This is where you get to say, it sounds like this project as it stands now might not resonate with you. What if? So we have a large foundation funder who has a great relationship with us, and we recently submitted a proposal. They were willing to review a draft before we submitted the final proposal. And in the feedback conversation we had about the draft, they said to us, you know, we really love what you're doing and we need a little extra specificity here, here, and here. But also, you know, we really only resonate with this half of it. We don't resonate with that half. We don't like that. And we said, okay, great. We'll rewrite the proposal so that it's only the first half. And they gave us a 6-figure gift as a result. So you can adapt to ask for part of your project. You can find a different but related project that the donor would be interested in. You can think about whether you can tweak the project a little bit. Now, it's really important to note that I'm not suggesting that you let the fundraising tail wag the strategic dog on this. Everything still needs to be grounded in your strategy, your priorities, and everything. Everything needs to flow from that. But sometimes in the midst of your fundraising pitch and strategy, you know, we all have multiple projects and programs and pieces that we're working on fundraising for. And if you get to know your donor well enough and you have that kind of conversation where you know one part resonates and one part doesn't, this is where you get to pivot. The other piece that I'll say is looping back to Lena's point about the stopper objection. That's important to keep in mind too, because at the end of the day, sometimes there really is just a stopper. Sometimes nothing is going to resonate with this particular donor, and that's okay. Our job is to matchmake, to find ways to connect people with what they're passionate about and help them make a difference. And that's not always our organization. And there are so many people out there who are interested in your work and your organization. So when you find somebody who's really in that stopper place, don't feel like you have to push forward through that, even trying the pivot method in that particular space. Instead, you can take your time and go find the donors who really resonate. So let's bring it all together now. We've talked about defining objections. We've talked about kinds of objections and categories, when and how to answer those objections. And now we have about 20 minutes left, I believe, so we have some time for Q&A. But before we dive into that, I'll ask Lena and Emmanuel if you two have anything you'd like to add.
No, thank you so much, Lena and Hope, for a great presentation. And we actually have quite a lot of questions that I'm sure our participants would like to hear your answers to. So I'll start with a question from Zoe, which relates actually to some of the last points that were made. And Zoe asked, how do you approach a funder to ask for a proposal review? So, for example, when you do the pivot method and trying to involve them, how do you know if the funder might be interested in this kind of collaboration?
That's a great question, Zoe. Thanks for raising that. In the particular instance I cited, we had a long-standing relationship with that funder. And when you have a close relationship with a foundation, it often ends up morphing to look a little bit more like an individual donor relationship, where you meet with the person who is, or the staff in charge of the foundation at various instances to update them on your work. You develop a close relationship, just ongoing communication back and forth. And that allows you to have that opening, that familiarity, especially if they have funded you in the past, to really talk about, we're thinking about submitting for this. What do you think? Is that going to resonate or not? And if they say, oh, I think you could go for this or that, that's when you have an idea of, oh, they might be open to giving me some feedback before the actual final deadline. And so you just ask, you say, we would love to get your thoughts on a draft. Is that something you'd be open to doing or open to reviewing? You always want to give the space for them to say no, so you ask in a very gentle fashion, because some foundations have a process where they say, out of our guidelines, we do not give feedback in advance. You just have to submit and figure out what it is, and that's that, and that's fine. And you say, what, I completely understand if you're not comfortable doing this, but we would love it if you would consider it.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that, Hope. I just would like to add a little thing, since I used to work at a foundation. I think what's also very critical when you're submitting any type of an ask to a foundation is really to make sure that there is congruency between what you're putting in your proposal and what the objection or the objectives are of that foundation. And I would even suggest that if the foundation outlines, one, two, or three different types of objectives, that you thread that into your proposal, if that is indeed congruent with what you do. But they are always looking to see that there is alignment between what you're doing and the mission of their foundation.
Yes, that's a great add. Thank you, Lena.
Great. We have another question that actually was asked a couple times, and I'm just going to summarize it by basically how many no's is enough no's. So how many objections should I welcome before I give up? That's
a really interesting question. I think for me, the high-level answer is that it depends on what the no's are. So it depends on the types of objections, and it depends on the donor. So if you have an existing relationship and you know the donor really well, and maybe you have a sense that they're the kind of person who will be very forthright and tell you, gee, this or this or this just don't resonate with me, that's great, because then you can drive forward to when they say no for the final time, and you can just ask very specifically, is this something you would consider? Is this project just something that's not going to resonate with you, or is this, what would you consider? You just have a very open dialogue. Some donors, however, prefer a little bit more of an indirect approach, and they might say, oh, I'm just too busy this month or this week or this day or whatever it is. And in those cases, you want to drive to the real objection. So then sometimes it's about, if you sense that the reason they're giving you a put off or a stall and they're sort of saying no that way, you want to be persistent enough that you get the sense that maybe this really isn't that they're busy. And then what can be helpful is to reframe the visit, so that if you think that they're saying no to a visit because they're worried it's going to be an ask, then you put the ask aside and you focus on the relationship building piece of it, and you say, I just want to be clear, I am not going to ask you for money at this time. I would just love to get together because I really want to specifically give you a tour of this new exhibit that I think you're going to love. It's already up in place, and I just want to hear how you're doing and get a chance to see you and catch up. And if you've said it that way, just make sure you follow through. Don't spring and ask. That's a cardinal rule. Don't ever spring and ask. But that's a different kind of how many no's is too many no's. So it's about clarifying why they're saying no, what the no is. And if you finally get to a point where they're saying, this really isn't my priority, my priorities are elsewhere, that's okay. They've just told you what their interests are, and go find the other folks who are more passionate about what you're doing. Lena, would you add anything?
I really wouldn't. I think that your point is well taken, that every case is an individual case. And, as I shared earlier, as we started the webinar, the cultivation piece is a continual circle around the whole process. And so, I really appreciate the fact that you said, to continue to question, let them tell you when no really means no. So, asking them, what would you consider? When can I get back to you? And trying to uncover what those real objections are. But again, I think you positioned it quite beautifully, that every single case is a different case depending on the donor.
And actually, I would add too, with my business training, that I was often told that a no is often a not now. So the cultivation and the cycle obviously comes into place because they have expressed all their objections, and you understand all of it right now, and there might be 10 of them, and that's okay. Doesn't mean that we should completely discard, but obviously for now, focus on the ones that are interested, but maybe in a couple years, in 10 years, we never know what could happen. All right, we have another question from Matt, who asks how to solicit a donation when the donor states we already support another cause in town. So that's a type of objection that I guess Matt has gotten, and how do you respond to that? Or how do you go from responding to that objection to possibly still asking for a donation?
I think for me, when I've heard that in the past, usually that's come in the context of, really what they're saying is a stopper, a no, my priorities are elsewhere, is what I hear from them. And so my response is usually, that's really great. I'm so glad that you're giving to the art museum or the Old Globe or whatever it is. That's wonderful. And if I feel passionately about still creating a relationship there for whatever reason, maybe I think there's a project that could be a great fit for them down the line, what I will typically say is, that's great. I would still love to just connect with you, no pressure to give to the Museum of Man, just would love to get to know you a little bit better, because I think you'd have a lot of fun here. So we have this event coming up, would love to invite you. And then I just keep them on my cultivation list of, hey, would you like to come to this? You might be interested in this exhibit opening, have a good time, very low key, low pressure, and let the relationship build and unfold over time. And then, you kind of see how things evolve. And as trust develops, they'll tell you more about their passions and priorities. And it may be that you'll find an organic fit of an ask down the road.
Great. We have another question that is more about actually getting to the donors, and it came in different forms into the chat and the Q&A box. So actually getting into the donors to hear and get those objections. So it's almost like it's kind of probably before in the cycle, like how do you even find those donors and how do you get those objections out of them, basically? Do you guys have any tips on that?
That's a good question too. It really, I think, depends on who you are and what your organization is. So I'm really lucky because as a museum, I have an easy way to find a lot of different people, from our visitors to our members to people our board members know. And I have a lot of opportunities for people to engage, from collections tours to coming to an event to coming for a museum tour, just a lot of different possibilities. There's a great person in fundraising whom I would highly recommend to you all as well, another book recommendation by Andy Robinson. He wrote How to Raise $500 to $5,000 from Almost Anyone. I believe that's the title. I'll pop that in the chat so you all can see it. And he talks about the ABCs of prospecting, which is that you need to have ability to give, belief in your cause, and connection. And he says something like, if you have all three, the person's a prospect. And of course, if you have a connection, then that means you get to meet the person. And you just need to figure out what the right inroad is for them. So whether it's a connection that your board member has or your CEO or another staff member has, and you basically pull them into your organization that way, and you say, would you come take a look at our programs? I'd love to have coffee or lunch. I'd love to get to know you better. Here's something I think you'd be interested in. And then he says, if you have two of the three, that person is a suspect, not a prospect. And if you have one of the three ABCs, that person is a stranger, and strangers don't give. And I always love that, because many of us have had the experience, I think, of well-meaning folks saying to us, oh, you know who has a ton of money? Bill Gates has a ton of money. You should just ask him for your cause. And it's great to go back to the ABCs and say, okay, well, he clearly has the ability. Does he know who we are and have the belief? Does he have a connection to any of us? That sort of thing. So look at that book from Andy Robinson. And the other great thing about his work too is he will, he helps you kind of think through, you know, so many people who are capable of giving, and there are more people than you think. And so it doesn't always have to be the big name philanthropists in town who are showing up on the front page of the paper with their most recent multi-million-dollar gift. Many, many people, if you sit down and go through your phone contacts, if you go through anybody who's ever been connected to your organization or who's on your newsletter list, there are all kinds of ways to find people who are connected to you, and then you can go out and ask.
All right, thank you, Hope. One more question. You know, we obviously talked about welcoming objections, handling them, really embracing them, and understanding they're part of the process. But the question came up, basically, should we always agree with the objections? And if we don't, like, how do you have any tips of what to do when you really disagree with the objection? The two-part question: should we always agree with them since we're embracing them? And if not, you know, what do we do about disagreement with the objection?
Oh, that's great. That's a great question. So I think I'd like to clarify something, which is that embracing and welcoming the objection does not mean agreeing with the objection. It means agreeing to hear what the person is saying. It means being open to questioning and understanding and listening very deeply to what your donor is saying. But it does not mean that you have to basically say, well, yes, you're absolutely right all of the time. The place where the donor is always right is in telling you what his or her passions or interests are. And so that's the space that you just basically respect when they say, well, gee, I really absolutely love buttons and teapots, and that's really my thing. And you say, that's great. I love that you love buttons and teapots. And they say, I'm really unhappy that you don't have any buttons and teapots in your museum. And I say, you know, yes, we don't have buttons and teapots in our museum. That's a fact. And they say, well, you know, you should have buttons and teapots in your museum. And that I disagree with. And so what I say is, you know, tell me more about why you feel that way. Let me understand more. If there's a zone of agreement that you can find, you know, boy, I understand that you're passionate about buttons and teapots because they're interesting artifacts. You know, we also are passionate about interesting artifacts. However, our mission is really more about sparking meaningful conversations about topics that are current and relevant, and buttons and teapots don't fit in with that mission right now. But you know what you might be really interested in is this really neat collection that we have that's linked to buttons and teapots, because so there's a way to pivot around it and try to find areas where you have common ground, but don't agree, because that's if you don't really agree. Your key point is to hear them out, make sure that you understand them, pause for a moment in their world and say, let me make sure I'm understanding you. And then once they feel completely heard, they'll be more open to you saying, that's great, actually, that's not a fit for us, or here's how we think about this differently, and so forth.
Yes, thank you, Hope. You know, here's a good place, too, for you to use the technique in negotiating objections that we talked about earlier in the feel, felt, and found. Because in a sense, you're demonstrating empathy with that particular donor by saying, I can understand how you feel. You're showing that empathy, and you're sharing that others may have experienced the same thing. And then you go into, until they found out that X, right? So again, very much in alignment to what Hope was saying is that we really need to understand what that objection is and to show the empathy and to really find out if there is alignment.
Very good. We have only a couple minutes left, and I guess there is the ultimate question that Tim asked, and it says, what is the best way to connect with more donors? So a little bit outside, the objections, but how do you build that trust, especially using, when you have those conversations, and how do you attract more people showing that you're open, to having those relationships?
So I'm not entirely sure if this is, if the emphasis on the word is connect, or if on the question is on the word connect in terms of what's the best way to connect with people, or if it's on more in terms of volume, how do you get out to more people? I think the connection piece is around what we've talked about through the webinar in terms of listening really deeply, making sure you get to know the donor's interests and so on. In terms of the more piece, one of the things to keep in mind is that philanthropy takes time, and really building the rapport and the relationships. I think a lot of what we're talking about in this webinar is around individual one-on-one conversations that you might be having with your major donors. In terms of the broad group of people, there are a whole host of techniques around direct mail and email marketing and social media and so forth that you can use to get out to more people. And that's probably a little bit outside the time we have today. But in terms of how to really leverage your time efficiently, I think a lot of it has to do with remembering that your job is to find the folks who have those synergies, as Lena talked about, with you. And that means that the more objections you welcome, the more quickly you figure out who's a fit and who may not be the best fit. And then once you triage folks into who the people are who really resonate with your mission and vision, that's when you can spend your time there and really focus there. So I hope that helps. In terms of the best way and methods, really it's unique to your organization in terms of inviting them in for tours, making sure that you're setting lunches and coffees and breakfasts and so forth. And it's unique to your donors. Some donors really want a phone call. Some donors want email. Some donors want the in-person meeting in their homes. Some donors want to come see your work where you are. Some people want a monthly touch point, a quarterly touch point, an annual touch point. So you have to kind of talk with your donors and figure out what's going to work for them.
All right, great. Thank you so much again, Hope and Lena, for a wonderful, packed webinar with a lot of tips. We hope that you all enjoyed it as well on the call and on the webinar. Just wanted to let you know that we have those webinars every month, and our next one is coming up on August 16, and that's when we will talk about supercharging your board. So we hope you can join us. Thank you again. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you next month.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.